Good evening. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Holly Ryan. I'm an Associate Professor of History here at LeMoyne College, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here tonight for our panel discussion as part of the two-row Wampum Renewal Campaign, which commemorates the earliest diplomatic agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Dutch colonists in the 17th century. This early agreement was recorded by the Haudenosaunee in a wampum belt, depicting Dutch and Haudenosaunee people traveling separately, yet still side by side, respecting one another's space and path. As many of you know, the Syracuse Post-Standard has covered the controversy surrounding the history and significance of the two-row wampum. Students here this evening, who have been learning to critically read and analyze the written word, may be wondering if and how oral tradition and pieces of material culture, such as a wampum belt, can be used to understand our past. And if one were to say, use it as a reference in a paper, how exactly do you cite it properly so as to not incur the wrath of your history professors? Tonight we have three leading scholars of Iroquois history and culture who may be able to answer these questions and many others. First this evening we'll have Jon Parmenter, Associate Professor of History at Cornell University and author of The Edge of the Woods, Iroquois of 1534 to 1701, which covers the period of the two-row. He will be considering the question, can indigenous oral tradition be reconciled with the documentary record? Scott Stevens is director of the Darcy McNichol Center for the American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago, which houses one of the best collections of scholarly material on American Indians in the world. Among his many responsibilities as director of the McNichol Center is to work to improve the quality of what is written and taught about American Indians. In addition to working with educators and scholars, he is working on a book entitled Indian Collectibles, Encounters, Appropriations, and Resistance in Native North America. He is here tonight to talk to us about notions of Haudenosaunee diplomacy as represented in the two-row and in the archives of the Newberry. Finally, we are lucky to have Jolene Rickard, Associate Professor in the Department of History and Art and Visual Studies and Director of the American Indian Program at Cornell, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this weekend. A visual historian, artist, and curator interested in the issues of indigeneity within a global context. Professor Rickard is currently conducting research in the Americas, Europe, New Zealand, and Australia, culminating in a new journal on indigenous aesthetics. Recent projects include consultants to the National Gallery of Canadian Art in preparation for the International Survey of Indigenous Art in 2013, also identified as the first, Ottawa, a participant in the Cornell Duke 54th Venice Biennial Dialogue in Italy in 2011, and she was a co-curator for the inaugural exhibition for the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. in 2004. Before I turn over the podium to Jon, I would like to offer public thanks to some individuals and organizations that made this program possible. In addition to the organizers of the two-row campaign, we have tables set up outside if you want more information. I would also like to thank the LeMoyne College Center for Peace and Global Studies and the Office of Multicultural Affairs for their generosity and support. Thanks to Monica Sande for negotiating so many logistical details for us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Mary McDonald, Professor of Religious Studies here at LeMoyne College, who has worked tirelessly for over 2 decades to educate LeMoyne students and the greater Syracuse community on the history and culture of our Haudenosaunee neighbors, through teaching classes, bringing in guest speakers, participating in cooperative programs with other colleges and universities, as well as organizing open dialogues between LeMoyne and members of the Onondaga Nation. Since my arrival at LeMoyne in 2006, Mary has served as a mentor to me as I began my work in American Indian history in the heart of Iroquois. Mary, I thank you for your guidance, and all of LeMoyne, will miss you when you go home to Australia. Thanks to all of you for coming, and after the talks, I invite you to engage in the conversation with your questions and comments. At this point, please join me in welcoming Jon Parmenter to LeMoyne College.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be here this evening. Thanks to, it's my first visit to LeMoyne, and I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm grateful to be here as a guest on an ancestral Onondaga territory. I made a lot of visits here over the past winter with my 9-year-old son's hockey team to the Nation Arena. Not all of them successful, but they were all enjoyable. So it's great to be here. My talk this evening emerged from my interest in the divergence I found between Haudenosaunee and non-native scholars in the published scholarship of the last 20 years regarding the historical validity of the concept of Guswenta, as currently understood and represented in the form of a two-row wampum belt. My purpose is to ask whether or not the different forms of historical knowledge privileged by the respective advocates may be reconciled with one another. Should we simply agree to disagree, acknowledging that there is more than one way to understand, present, and record history? Should variations, gaps, and shortcomings in the European authored record assume precedence over an arguably unbroken line of native oral tradition concerning a particular phenomenon, or vice versa? Should we place the two lines of evidence into dialogue with one another and try to determine whether and how they may be integrated? Tonight I'll make a case for the latter approach, sharing the results from my analysis of the colonial era documentary record for corroboration of Haudenosaunee tradition concerning Guswenta. My findings demonstrate substantial convergence and complementarity between the two perspectives and suggest that in this case, the comparison and integration of oral tradition and documentary evidence might yield a more robust understanding of the history of the two-row agreement than would result from either undertaken alone. Guswenta may best be understood as a Haudenosaunee term embodying the ongoing negotiation of their relationship to European colonizers and their descendants. The underlying concept of Guswenta emphasizes the distinct identity of the two peoples and a mutual engagement to coexist in peace without interference in the affairs of the other. The two-row belt, as it is commonly known, depicts the Guswenta relationship in visual form via a beaded belt of white wampum with two parallel lines of purple wampum along its length. The lines symbolizing a separate but equal relationship between the two entities based on mutual benefit and mutual respect for each party's inherent national integrity and freedom of movement. Neither side may attempt to steer the vessel of the other as it travels along its own self-determined path. Contemporary Haudenosaunee oral tradition identifies the original elaboration of the Guswenta agreement with a circa 1613 agreement negotiated between Mohawks and a Dutch trader named Jacob Eelkens at Tawaganshi. These negotiations were a precursor to the formal establishment of Dutch Fort Nassau at nearby Normanskill Creek in 1614. For more than a century, and with increasing frequency since 1989, Haudenosaunee leaders, activists, and scholars have consistently and explicitly asserted the historical veracity of Guswenta and the two-row belt as foundational to their understanding of early colonial era cross-cultural negotiations governed by mutual respect, reciprocity, and renewal. From the standpoint of the Haudenosaunee, the Guswenta relationship embodies one of interdependence. The two parties to the agreement may share the same space while retaining their status as distinct political entities. Put another way, Guswenta reflects a joint decision to remain independent together. The most recent Haudenosaunee articulations of the Guswenta tradition in published scholarship point to the utility of its message as a model for repairing indigenous settler relations in contemporary North America. In contrast, non-native historians of the Haudenosaunee have been at considerable pains to dispute the idea of Guswenta and or the two-row belt as legitimate historical phenomenon. In 1987, William Fenton, Charles Gearing, and William Starna authored an article that established a parchment document purporting to represent the 21 April 1613 treaty between Dutch and Mohawk representatives at Tawaganshi as a 20th century forgery perpetrated by an eccentric Dutch-American medical doctor named L.G. Van Loon. Gearing and Starna have restated this argument energetically during the past year in an effort to discredit contemporary commemorations of the two-row agreement, and Starna is on record objecting to the scheduled 2013 events based, as he put it, on an obviously phony record that is worthless as the infamous Hitler diaries. 20 years after the initial Fenton-Gearing-Starna critique, historian Catherine Muller, publishing an article in the American Indian Quarterly, not only characterized the two-row treaty as a 19th century verbalization of an ancient assumption of autonomy by Haudenosaunee people residing in Canada for contemporary political purposes. And for those of you who might be interested, she implicated Seth Newhouse and John Smoke Johnson as the prime movers of this supposed innovation. Not stopping there, Muller went on to warn contemporary Haudenosaunee people against employing the concepts associated with the two-row in support of any political claim in the court system, given its supposedly perplexing origins and ambiguous status. These two non-native critiques are noteworthy, not only for their effort to foreclose any further discussion of the history of the two-row agreement, but also for the ways in which they approach the problem of authenticating Guswenta as a historical concept. Fenton, Gearing, and Starna concentrate on the very beginning of the paper trail related to the two-row agreement, dismiss a single problematic text as a fraud, and undertake no further investigation of the question. Muller's study focuses on the latter end of recorded documentation, employing a discussion of 20th century Haudenosaunee efforts to repatriate several wampum belts obtained from private collectors in the 19th century, and proceeding backwards in historical time, concluding that in lieu of any documented association between a surviving physical two-row wampum belt and written evidence of the innate understanding of its message of autonomy, non-native scholars must disregard, in her words, the two-row agreement as a historically valid expression of Haudenosaunee social, political, or economic relations with settler colonies. Absence of evidence, in other words, is taken by Muller as evidence of Guswenta's absence. Yet she does not attempt a comprehensive examination of the sources created prior to 1870. So my question coming to this was, what happens when we look at the documentary record that falls between those chronological benchmarks of 1613 and 1870? Can we align evidence from written sources in that period with the substantial body of Haudenosaunee oral tradition concerning Guswenta? Undertaking such an exercise reveals substantial documentary evidence in support of Haudenosaunee oral tradition concerning the two-row agreement, attesting to its deeply rooted character in Haudenosaunee cultural understanding of the past. Haudenosaunee speakers recited or mentioned the Guswenta tradition for Anglo-American and French colonial audiences on at least 14 different occasions between 1656 and 1744. Additionally, William Johnson, an Irish-American fur trader who served the colony of New York as an Indian agent and in 1756 ascended to the Crown-appointed office of Superintendent of Indian Affairs, related a version of the tradition on two subsequent occasions, in 1748 and 1755, and a brief version, probably ghostwritten by Johnson, appeared in New York Council member Archibald Kennedy's 1751 pamphlet, The Importance of Gaining and Preserving the Friendship of the Indians to the British Interest Considered. Note that these examples are all confined to published primary documents widely available to researchers for decades. The single most comprehensive written source corroborating the early 17th century origins of a Guswenta relationship between Iroquois nations and the Dutch appears in a 27 June 1689 speech by a delegation of Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Oneida headmen before the magistrates of Albany, 118 words. The Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, and Oneidas speak to the magistrates of Albany and say they are come to renew the old covenant made with Jacques many years ago, who came with a ship into their waters and received them as brethren. And then the Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas desired him to establish himself in this country, and the Senecas and Cayugas they drew into that general covenant, and that they had with one accord planted the tree of good understanding. They say that the Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas did carry the anchor of the ship that Jacques came in to Onondaga, that being the meeting place of the five nations, and this they now renew and confirm. I'm not going to read you the other 16 recitations, but what I am going to do is give you a brief review of the patterns that come up in the documentary evidence that show us a striking degree of consistency over time in the expression of the fundamental principles of the Guswenta tradition by Haudenosaunee speakers, as well as their recognition and acceptance by non-native colonial authorities. The idea of the origins of a covenant or alliance with Jacques, the Dutch, or generic Christians appears in all 14 documented Haudenosaunee recitations between 1656 and 1744. 3 make explicit mention of an individual named Jacques, widely considered a reference to Jacob Eelkens mentioned earlier. Dating of the original agreement prior to 1620 finds support in the 1701 recitation, in which Haudenosaunee delegates describe their original agreement with the Dutch occurring above 80 years prior to that date. And in 1744, Onondaga headman Canasatigo dated the origin of the relationship to above 100 years ago. William Johnson's versions emphasize, unsurprisingly, the Anglo-Iroquois phase of the relationship, which originates in a 1664 treaty. His 1755 recitation notes that the relationship had existed for almost 100 years. The evolution over time of the media linking the Haudenosaunee to European newcomers, from a piece of tree bark or rope to an iron chain and eventually to a silver or covenant chain, may be discerned in all but one of the Haudenosaunee recitations, and this transformation is also present in each of the 3 documented European renderings post-dating 1748. Explicit associations of the agreement with the concept of mutual security, reciprocal obligations, or brotherhood appear in 10 of the 14 Haudenosaunee recitation and each of the 3 European authored versions. 8 of the 14 Haudenosaunee recitations make specific associations of their European alliance partners with a ship or sailing vessel, and this language is echoed in the 1748 Johnson and 1751 Kennedy accounts. A significant indication of the agreement's endorsement by the League as a whole is found in the preeminent role assumed by Onondaga leaders in relating the Guswenta tradition before European audiences. 5 of the 14 recitations are given by Onondaga speakers. 4 of the 14 Haudenosaunee recitations make mention of trade as a foundational element of the relationship. This theme appears in the European versions. 3 associate the agreement explicitly with wampum, and while Johnson punctuated his 1748 recitation with an unspecified, quote, large belt of wampum, it is worth noting here that no documented recitation from the period found to date provides a specific correlation with a 2-row pattern wampum. Now, the lack of any association between the conceptual underpinnings of Guswenta and a 2-row belt in the documented recitation of the tradition is striking, but ultimately less significant of an issue than it might appear at first glance. Descriptions of wampum belts in documentary sources, particularly from the early period of contact, are notoriously rare, and even when they are found, tend to be frustratingly vague. Additionally, we must understand and appreciate that wampum belts are susceptible to physical deterioration over time. Onondaga leader Canasatigo pointed this out in his 1744 recitation of the tradition. And we also have to think about the extensive loss and disassembly of belts conveyed by Haudenosaunee representatives to non-native recipients. Dutch officials in Albany routinely disassembled belts given by Haudenosaunee delegates in order to tally up their raw monetary value in wampum well into the 1670s. Bead count. Ethnographic evidence also indicates that wampum belts were occasionally taken apart and the beads repurposed by Haudenosaunee people themselves. So given all these issues surrounding the documentation and physical survival of belts, a better question to ask might be, at what point in time would it have been possible for Haudenosaunee people to produce a 2-row belt? The technological needs for the production of a pattern belt with geometrical designs or representational imagery would include 3 things. Short tubular white shell beads, what we know as wampum. A method of weaving that permits side-to-side stringing of those tubular beads, and dark-colored tubular beads, whether they were purple wampum made from the shell of the quahog clam, dark-colored tubular glass beads obtained in trade with Europeans, or the use of a pigment to color appropriate sections of a monochrome wampum belt for the production of patterns or geometrical designs or other representational imagery. Recent archaeological studies of wampum confirm that Haudenosaunee production of a recognizable two-row belt would indeed have been possible circa 1613 or very shortly thereafter. The presence of white shell wampum, as described above, is well documented at multiple Haudenosaunee sites after the mid-16th century. Side-to-side stringing of tubular beads cut from European sheet brass is noted at the Seneca Culbertson site, occupied in the late 16th century, and early evidence of wampum woven into small objects dates from the turn of the 17th century. The availability of tubular purple wampum in 1613 is a matter of debate among scholars, owing to the perceived need for European-produced metal drills in the manufacturing process, but examples of these have been found at the Seneca Fugal site, occupied between 1605 and 1625. Now, establishing the possibility of a two-row belt's existence in 1613 is not the same as direct evidence of association, but given that archaeological recovery does not necessarily represent an expression of the earliest use of a particular cultural form, and given the significance of wampum as a material to facilitate communication across cultural boundaries at this precise moment in time, serious consideration of the validity of oral tradition concerning the principles of Guswenta and its association with the two-row belt, long before the physical survival of these things in the mid-19th century, seems fully warranted. To conclude, evidence of Haudenosaunee in European recitations of the Guswenta tradition indicates clearly two things: the remarkable durability over time of ideas associated with a two-row relationship does not depend on the legitimacy of a single document. Secondly, Haudenosaunee and contemporary Europeans verbalized these ideas long before the late 19th century. The 17 recitations documented over the mid-17th to mid-18th century challenge claims that the two-row post-dated or grew from the Anglo-American Covenant chain alliance commonly dated from 1677. The most striking evidence that Europeans were aware of the ship and canoe discourse of the Guswenta tradition, so critical to its underlying message, appears in the personal seal devised in 1757 by Sir William Johnson, employed during his tenure as British Superintendent of Indian Affairs as a means of certifying written testimonials offered to Allied Native Americans as a documentation of their formal ties to the Crown. This seal was on a certificate that was in the New York State Archives, the original burned in the 1911 State Capitol fire, but a sketch existed, and this is a reproduction of the sketch. You can see on it a European sailing ship and a native paddled canoe depicted in parallel. Guswenta relations are not static. They evolve over time as ties between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, and the later's English and American successors, deepened and socio-political circumstances grew more complex, but they did exist. Indeed, this case study suggests strongly that it's incumbent upon all scholars, considering the historicity of indigenous oral traditions, especially regarding something as fundamentally significant as the Guswenta, to do more than simply identify a single document as a fake, or to set the bar for evidentiary proof of a concept's existence to practically impossible standards, such as requiring a surviving physical two-row belt from the colonial era that can be explicitly associated with a documentary source. That doesn't happen very often. Given the obvious circumstances of the settler majority population's control of the archives and the structural disinterest of settler nation states in documenting the distinct and divergent visions of law, informing traditions of resistance and opposition among colonized peoples, we may well ask why it is so difficult to accept the possibility that the Haudenosaunee traditionalists, who speak confidently of agreements that their forebears entered into, may be better custodians of the spirit of history than we later Americans who remain preoccupied with the written record. One of the primary means by which settler colonialism sustains itself is through the denial of the authenticity or antiquity of indigenous traditions, or both. Eurocentric scholarship, in adopting such approaches, works to conflate contemporaneous cultural and political differences between indigenous and settler nations into temporal sequence. Shorn of a true or authentic past, the indigenous nation is placed in an inferior position, behind in terms of its cultural development, and thus susceptible to the demands of the colonizing mission. Mohawk legal scholar Joyce King adds a further salient point regarding the difficulties contemporary Haudenosaunee nations face in contending with the voting democracies of the United States and Canada. As each new settler regime leaves behind the policies of its predecessor, it tends to forget the agreements and lessons of the past, thereby placing the burdens of preserving memory and promoting education regarding the terms of those agreements on Haudenosaunee leaders. Non-Native historians are only beginning to recognize the value of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing in their research. This case study suggests that an effort to reconcile the documentary record with Indigenous tradition enables us to move beyond not only arguments that seek to discredit or delegitimize Native people's perspectives, but also facile and unsatisfying conclusions regarding multiple ways of knowing about or remembering the past. Those can be cop-outs. It's worth noting in this context that the underlying concept of the two-row agreement promotes a fuller recognition of the simultaneous coexistence of others with their own historical trajectories, their own political priorities, and their own stories to tell. Analyzing the historicity of the Guswenta raises our awareness of a Haudenosaunee understanding of cross-cultural relationships that works towards unity, not uniformity, by demonstrating how differences between individuals, communities, and nations must be acknowledged and integrated rather than annihilated or absorbed.